My name is Marcus Williams, though that don't matter much now. I've been hiding for 8 years, moving from city to city, never staying nowhere too long. People think they know how the game works on the West Coast, think they understand who really runs things. They see the colors, the sets, the beefs between Crips and Bloods, and they think that's all there is. But I'm here to tell you the truth about something deeper, something that goes way beyond gang politics. There's a man behind the curtain, pulling strings that most soldiers don't even know exist. For 15 years, I was part of that machine, climbing ranks, moving weight, spilling blood. But I never knew who was really calling the shots until it was almost too late. It started back in 2005 when I was just 17, running with the 8-tray gangster Crips in South Central. My pops had been locked up since I was 12. Mom's was working 2 jobs just to keep lights on. The streets were all I knew, and the set was my family. We was pushing rock on the corner of Crenshaw and Slauson, making maybe $300-400 a day if we was lucky. That was good money for a kid from the hood, but it wasn't real money. Not the kind that could change your life. Then one day, this older cat named Big Mike pulled me aside. "Young blood," he said. "You got potential, but you thinking too small? There's bigger moves to be made if you ready to step up." Big Mike introduced me to a different level of the game entirely. We wasn't just slanging to crackheads on the corner no more. We was moving weight to other sets, coordinating with suppliers from different cities, managing territories that stretched from Compton to Long Beach. The money was 10 times what I'd ever seen, but so was the danger. Other crews wanted what we had, and they was willing to kill for it. I learned to handle business with my hands and my gun, earned respect through violence when necessary. Within 2 years, I was running my own corner, had soldiers under me, was making more money than my mom's ever dreamed of. But even then, I knew there was levels above me I couldn't see. The first time I realized how deep this thing really went was during a meeting in 2008. We had beef with some Bloods from Inglewood who was trying to push into our territory. Our OG called a sit-down at this warehouse in Carson, said we was going to settle things properly. But when I got there, it wasn't just Crips in the room. There was Bloods, some Mexican cats I didn't recognize, even some white boys in suits who looked like they never been in the hood before. And they was all listening to this one dude who wasn't wearing colors, wasn't representing no set, but everybody seemed to know who he was. They called him the coordinator, and when he talked, everybody shut up and listened. That night I learned that the streets had management I never knew existed. The coordinator laid out a plan that blew my mind. Instead of fighting over territory like dogs, he wanted us to work together. Crips would handle certain neighborhoods, Bloods would take others, Mexicans would manage the supply lines, and everybody would get their cut. "There's enough money for everyone," he said, "but only if we stop acting like savages and start thinking like businessmen." He had charts, maps, financial projections like some corporate presentation. But what really got my attention was the numbers he was throwing around. We was talking about millions of dollars, not thousands. Operations that spanned multiple states. Connections that reached all the way to Colombia and Mexico. This wasn't street-level hustling anymore. This was organized crime on a national scale. After that meeting, everything changed for me. I got promoted within my set, started handling bigger operations, coordinating with crews I used to consider enemies. The money was incredible. I was pulling in $50,000-60,000 a month just from my piece of the action. Bought my mom's a house in a better neighborhood. Got myself a fleet of cars, jewelry, everything I thought success looked like. But with the money came responsibilities I wasn't prepared for. I had to enforce the coordinator's rules, make sure everybody was following the plan, handle disputes between different crews. Sometimes that meant diplomatic solutions. Sometimes it meant violence. The coordinator made it clear that disrupting the business was the only unforgivable sin. The structure was more complex than anything I'd imagined. Each major gang had representatives who reported to regional managers who reported to the coordinator. But even he wasn't the top of the pyramid. There was someone above him, someone nobody ever saw or talked about directly. They called him the architect, and his word was law. Orders would come down through the coordinator, but they always started with "the architect wants" or "the architect has decided." I never met this person, never even heard his real name, but his influence was everywhere. Every major decision, every strategic move, every territorial agreement had his fingerprints on it. He was the ghost in the machine, the invisible hand guiding everything. My role evolved over the years from soldier to manager to something like a regional coordinator myself. I was responsible for keeping peace between different sets in a huge territory that stretched from South Central to the South Bay. That meant I had to understand the business from every angle: supply chains, distribution networks, money laundering, political protection. The operation was sophisticated beyond belief. We had legitimate businesses as fronts, offshore accounts, relationships with corrupt cops and politicians. The coordinator taught me that violence was expensive and messy, that real power came from being invisible and efficient. Dead bodies draw attention, he always said. Silent money doesn't. The deeper I got into the organization, the more I understood that what people saw on the streets was just theater. The gang colors, the territorial beefs, the dramatic shootouts that made the news, most of it was either manufactured or exaggerated to keep law enforcement focused on the wrong things. While cops were chasing down kids in blue and red bandanas, the real money was being moved by people in business suits who looked like accountants and lawyers. The street gangs were both the muscle and the distraction, handling the dangerous work while the serious money flowed through channels that were completely invisible to outsiders. We was playing our part in a show that kept the real bosses safely hidden. By 2012, I was making more money than I knew what to do with, but I was also starting to see cracks in the system. Some of the younger guys was getting restless, wanting more action, more respect, more territory. They didn't understand that everything was carefully balanced, that our success depended on maintaining relationships with crews we used to hate. The coordinator was spending more time putting out fires, dealing with hotheads who thought they could improve on a system that had been working for years. And for the first time since I'd been in the game, I started hearing whispers about the architect being unhappy with how things was being handled. When a man that powerful gets dissatisfied, people start disappearing. That's when I knew I needed to start watching my back. The first sign that things was changing came when Big Mike got killed. Not in some dramatic shootout or gang war, but quiet like professional. Found dead in his apartment from what looked like a heart attack, except Big Mike was only 38 and healthier than most 20-year-olds. The coordinator told us it was natural causes, but I knew better. Big Mike had been asking too many questions lately, wondering why certain orders was coming down, trying to understand more about the upper levels of the organization. In our world, curiosity was dangerous, and knowing too much could get you eliminated. The message was clear: stay in your lane, do your job, don't ask questions about things above your pay grade. The meeting where the coordinator introduced us to the new structure was held in a different location than usual. Some fancy conference room in downtown LA that looked like where real businessmen made real deals. But the people in that room was anything but legitimate. There was representatives from every major set on the West Coast, plus some faces I didn't recognize who looked like they come from way outside the hood. The coordinator explained that the organization was evolving to meet new challenges and opportunities. Translation: somebody higher up had decided we wasn't making enough money fast enough, and changes was going to be made whether we liked it or not. The new operations went way beyond traditional drug dealing. We was moving into identity theft, credit card fraud, cybercrime, even human trafficking for specialized labor. The coordinator brought in experts, hackers, forgers, financial specialists who could make dirty money look clean faster than we ever imagined. My territory expanded to include online operations run by kids who looked like they belonged in college, not on corners. They was making more money sitting at computers than most of us ever made selling rocks. It was a whole different world, but the rules was the same. Follow orders, don't ask questions, and never forget who was really in charge. The money flowing through our operations became astronomical. We wasn't talking about millions anymore. We was talking about hundreds of millions annually. The coordinator showed us spreadsheets that looked like Fortune 500 company reports. We had revenue streams from dozens of different criminal enterprises, all coordinated to maximize profit and minimize risk. The street-level drug trade that most people associated with gangs was becoming just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. We was running a criminal empire that had its fingers in everything from pharmaceuticals to political campaigns. The scope was mind-blowing, but so was the paranoia that came with managing something that big. My promotion to regional manager came with access to information that changed everything I thought I knew about the game. I learned that the architect wasn't just some mysterious figure above the coordinator. He was part of a network that included similar operations across the entire country. There was organizations like ours running in Chicago, Detroit, New York, Miami, all coordinated by people who never appeared in law enforcement databases. They was sharing resources, intelligence, even personnel when needed. What I thought was a West Coast operation was actually part of a national criminal syndicate that made the old Italian families look like corner store robbers. The level of corruption required to operate at this scale was staggering. We had cops on payroll, judges who owed favors, politicians who looked the other way in exchange for campaign contributions. But it went deeper than simple bribery. The coordinator explained that some of these people was true believers, convinced that our organization provided stability in communities where government had failed. We employ more people than most legitimate businesses, he told me during one of our private meetings. We provide services the system can't or won't provide. Some folks understand that what we do is necessary, even if it ain't legal. The technology side of the operation was run by a crew that most gang members never saw. They worked out of buildings that looked like startup companies, wearing regular clothes, driving regular cars, living regular lives. But they was generating more revenue than all the street operations combined. They was running sophisticated scams that targeted everything from social security benefits to corporate bank accounts. The coordinator called them digital soldiers, and they was just as important to the organization as any gunman, maybe more important because their work was invisible and their profits was enormous. The protection racket operated on levels I never suspected. We wasn't just shaking down local businesses for a few hundred a week. We was providing actual security services to legitimate companies who couldn't get adequate protection through legal channels. Rich folks in gated communities was paying us to make sure their neighborhoods stayed safe. Some of them knew exactly who they was dealing with. Others thought they was just hiring an unusually effective private security firm. The money was good, the work was relatively clean, and it gave us connections to people with real power and influence in the legal world. The relationship between different gangs under the architect's system was nothing like what people saw on TV or read in newspapers. Yeah, there was still conflicts and competition, but it was managed conflict, designed to serve larger purposes. Sometimes beefs was manufactured to distract law enforcement from major operations. Sometimes territories was redistributed to optimize efficiency. Sometimes crews was eliminated, not because of disrespect or territory disputes, but because they wasn't generating sufficient returns on investment. Violence was a business tool, not an emotional response. Cold, calculated, always serving the bottom line. The recruitment process was sophisticated too. The coordinator had people in schools, community centers, even churches, identifying kids with the right combination of intelligence, desperation, and ruthlessness. They wasn't just looking for muscle anymore. They needed hackers, accountants, logistics specialists, people who could think strategically about complex problems. Some of these recruits never wore colors, never claimed sets, never appeared in gang databases. They was invisible soldiers in a war most people didn't even know was being fought. The organization was evolving faster than law enforcement could adapt. The money laundering operations was a work of art. We had front companies in every industry you could imagine: restaurants, construction, entertainment, technology, import, export. Each one was carefully designed to justify large cash transactions without raising red flags. The coordinator worked with financial experts who understood banking regulations better than most compliance officers. Money would enter the system dirty and come out clean, with paper trails that could fool auditors and investigators. It was like watching magicians make elephants disappear, except the elephants was millions of dollars in criminal proceeds. The political connections went deeper than I ever imagined. The coordinator showed me photographs from fundraising events where he was shaking hands with mayors, congressmen, even state governors. These wasn't just photo ops. These was business relationships. Politicians needed campaign contributions and reliable voting blocks, and the organization could provide both. In exchange, we got advance warning about law enforcement operations, favorable treatment in courts, and legislation that created new opportunities for profit. Democracy was just another marketplace, and we was major players. The intelligence gathering capabilities rivaled what you'd expect from government agencies. We had informants in police departments, prosecutors' offices, federal agencies, rival organizations. The coordinator could often predict law enforcement moves weeks before they happened. He knew which investigations was serious and which was just for show. He understood how political pressure affected prosecutorial priorities. This information was incredibly valuable, allowing us to adjust operations before problems developed. Knowledge was power, and we had more knowledge than anyone realized. The expansion into legitimate businesses wasn't just about money laundering. The coordinator was building an empire that could eventually operate completely legally, or at least appear to. Real estate development, technology companies, entertainment ventures, all funded with criminal proceeds, but run as legitimate businesses. The goal was to create so much legitimate wealth that the criminal origins would become irrelevant. In 20 years, the coordinator told me, our grandchildren will be respected business people, philanthropists, community leaders. The past will be forgotten, and the future will be clean. The pressure to maintain the balance between all these different elements was enormous. Every day brought new challenges, territorial disputes that threatened to disrupt operations, law enforcement investigations that required careful management, internal conflicts that could tear apart carefully constructed alliances. The coordinator was constantly putting out fires, solving problems, managing personalities who wasn't used to being managed. And always in the background was the knowledge that the architect was watching, evaluating, deciding whether current leadership was adequate for the challenges ahead. That pressure was enough to break most people, but it also created incredible discipline and efficiency throughout the organization. The first time I met someone who claimed to know the architect personally was during a crisis that almost destroyed everything we'd built. A federal task force had gotten too close to one of our major money laundering operations, and we needed to implement emergency protocols that required approval from the very top of the organization. The coordinator was out of the country handling business in Mexico, so this woman showed up who I'd never seen before. She was maybe 50, well-dressed, looked like she could be somebody's grandmother. But when she talked, it was clear she had authority that came directly from the architect himself. She knew details about operations that only a handful of people should have access to. She called herself the liaison and explained that the architect had been monitoring our situation closely. According to her, he wasn't just concerned about the immediate federal investigation. He was worried about systemic weaknesses in our organization that made us vulnerable to this kind of pressure. The architect believes in continuous improvement, she told the assembled regional managers. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but what almost kills you reveals where you need to get stronger. She had come to implement changes that would make us more resilient, more difficult to penetrate, more capable of surviving the kind of scrutiny that was inevitably coming our way. The changes she implemented was radical and immediate. Communication protocols was completely overhauled, with new encryption systems that required specialized training to use. Financial operations was restructured to create additional layers of separation between dirty money and clean investments. Personnel was reassigned, based on security evaluations that somehow included information about people's personal lives that nobody should have known. Some longtime members of the organization simply disappeared, not violently, but completely. Their families was told they'd been relocated for security reasons, given generous settlements, and instructed never to make contact again. The liaison revealed that the architect had been planning for this kind of crisis for years. There was backup systems, alternative supply, chains, contingency plans that could be activated if primary operations was compromised. But more importantly, there was a philosophy behind all these preparations. The architect understands that law enforcement is just another competitor in the marketplace, she explained. They have advantages: legal authority, public support, government resources. But we have advantages too: flexibility, motivation, and most importantly, we understand that this is a business, not a crusade. The federal investigation that had triggered this crisis was being managed in ways I never expected. Instead of simply trying to avoid detection, the architect's strategy involved actively shaping the investigation to protect the most valuable assets while sacrificing less important operations. Some arrests was actually orchestrated by our own people, targeting individuals who had become liabilities or whose removal would benefit the organization. The liaison showed us evidence that some of the federal agents leading the investigation was receiving information that came from our own intelligence gathering, though they didn't know the source. We wasn't just evading law enforcement, we was directing it. The technology infrastructure supporting our operations was revealed to be far more sophisticated than I had imagined. The liaison brought in technical specialists who showed us systems that could monitor law enforcement communications, track the movements of federal agents, even access databases that was supposed to be secure. This wasn't just criminal hackers working from basement computers. This was enterprise-level intelligence gathering that rivaled what government agencies was capable of. The investment in this kind of technology was enormous, but so was the advantage it provided in staying ahead of investigators. The financial audit conducted during this restructuring revealed the true scope of the architect's empire. Our West Coast operations was just one division of a criminal enterprise that spanned continents. There was similar organizations operating in Europe, Asia, South America, all coordinated through communication networks that was invisible to traditional law enforcement. Money flowed between these operations based on opportunities and threats that was constantly shifting. If heat got too intense in one region, operations could be temporarily scaled back, while other divisions picked up the slack. It was like a multinational corporation, except the product was illegal and the profits was unimaginable. The personnel changes implemented by the liaison was designed to create a more professional organization with less vulnerability to individual weaknesses. People was evaluated not just on their criminal skills, but on their psychological profiles, their family situations, their potential to become informants under pressure. Those who passed the evaluation received better compensation, additional training, and access to support systems that helped them manage the stress of criminal life. Those who failed simply vanished, though their families was always taken care of financially. It was ruthless but efficient, ensuring that only the most reliable people remained in positions of responsibility. The relationship between our organization and international drug cartels was managed at levels I hadn't previously understood. The architect wasn't just buying product from suppliers, he was partnering with them on operations that integrated production, transportation, and distribution across multiple countries. There was shared intelligence, coordinated timing of major shipments, even joint ventures into new markets. The liaison explained that the old model of independent criminal organizations competing against each other was obsolete. The future belonged to networks that could cooperate across borders, cultures, and criminal specialties. The corruption networks revealed during this reorganization was breathtaking in their scope and sophistication. The architect had people in positions throughout government, not just cops and judges, but regulators, customs officials, airport security, even congressional staff members. These wasn't simple bribery relationships. They was long-term assets who had been cultivated over years, sometimes decades. Some of them had been recruited while they was still in college or military service, then supported as they built careers in public service. By the time they was in positions to be useful, the relationship was so deep and complex that exposure would destroy their lives completely. The legitimate business investments was revealed to be far more extensive than anyone had realized. The architect controlled significant stakes in dozens of companies across multiple industries. Some of them was fronts for criminal operations, but others was genuine businesses that generated legal profits. The strategy was to build enough legitimate wealth that the criminal enterprises could eventually be phased out entirely. The architect's ultimate goal, the liaison explained, is to become so wealthy through legal means that illegal activities become unnecessary risks rather than necessary income sources. The education and training programs for organization members was surprisingly comprehensive. There was classes in finance, technology, foreign languages, even public speaking and business etiquette. The architect understood that criminal enterprises was limited by the capabilities of their personnel, so he invested heavily in developing human resources. Members who showed aptitude was sent to legitimate colleges and universities, with tuition paid and cover stories established. Some of them was being groomed to become the legitimate business leaders who would eventually take over the legal side of the empire. The succession planning revealed the long-term thinking that separated the architect from ordinary criminals. He wasn't just building an organization to benefit himself. He was creating an institution that could survive and thrive for generations. There was detailed plans for leadership transitions, conflict resolution mechanisms, and adaptation strategies for changing legal and political environments. The liaison showed us organizational charts that looked like they belonged to major corporations, except the executives was people I knew had blood on their hands. It was simultaneously impressive and terrifying to see criminal activity organized with such professional sophistication. The psychological pressure of operating at this level was taking its toll on everyone involved. The constant awareness that every decision could have life or death consequences, the knowledge that mistakes would be punished severely, the isolation required to maintain operational security. It was wearing people down in ways that street-level criminal activity never had. The liaison brought in counselors and therapists who specialized in helping people manage stress in high-pressure environments. They couldn't know the specific details of what was causing the stress, but they could teach coping mechanisms that helped people function effectively despite the psychological burden. The surveillance and counter-surveillance capabilities was like something out of a spy movie. The architect's people could monitor communications, track vehicles, identify undercover agents, even predict law enforcement operations based on patterns in resource allocation and personnel movement. But they could also make people disappear from surveillance systems, create false identities that could fool background checks, and establish communication channels that was completely invisible to electronic monitoring. The level of technical sophistication required massive investment, but it provided security that was worth any cost. The international connections provided opportunities that domestic operations alone could never achieve. The liaison described partnerships with criminal organizations in countries where corruption was more systematic and law enforcement was less capable. These relationships provided access to products, markets, and safe havens that was critical for long-term survival. But they also created exposure to different types of risks, including political instability, cultural misunderstandings, and competition from groups that operated by different rules entirely. The medical and healthcare support provided to organization members was another indication of the architect's long-term thinking. There was private medical facilities that could treat injuries without reporting requirements, pharmaceutical connections that could provide medications without prescriptions, even cosmetic surgery capabilities for people who needed to change their appearance for security reasons. Mental health support was available for people dealing with trauma, addiction counseling for those struggling with substance abuse, and family support services for dependents who needed help managing the stress of having criminal relatives. It was like a comprehensive employee benefits package, except the employer was a criminal empire. The beginning of the end started when the coordinator got arrested, not for anything related to our operations, but for a domestic violence charge that spiraled into a federal investigation when they found weapons in his house during the initial search. It was exactly the kind of stupid mistake that the architect had always warned against: personal problems creating professional vulnerabilities. Within hours of the arrest, the liaison activated protocols that seemed designed specifically for this situation. Key personnel was moved to safe locations, sensitive materials was destroyed, and communication networks was shut down. But the damage was already spreading faster than containment efforts could control it. The coordinator knew too much about too many operations to be trusted in federal custody, even for a short time. The organization had procedures for dealing with arrested members, but someone at his level presented unprecedented risks. The liaison explained that the architect had made a difficult decision. The coordinator would not be allowed to become a cooperating witness under any circumstances. I understood what that meant, but I also knew that eliminating someone in federal custody would bring down heat that could destroy everything. The solution was more subtle and more terrifying than simple assassination. The coordinator died of an apparent suicide in his cell, but the timing and method left no doubt about what had really happened. The federal investigation that followed the coordinator's death was different from anything we'd faced before. The agents was asking questions that indicated they understood our organizational structure better than we'd thought possible. They knew about connections between different crews, financial relationships that should have been invisible, even communication protocols that we thought was secure. Someone had been talking, but it wasn't the coordinator. He'd died before he could say anything significant. The leak was coming from inside the organization, from someone with access to information that could destroy us all. The paranoia that followed was toxic and destructive. People who had worked together for years was suddenly suspicious of each other. Meetings became exercises in mutual accusation and defensive positioning. The liaison brought in investigators who specialized in identifying internal security threats, but their methods was harsh and invasive. Several longtime members was eliminated based on circumstantial evidence and psychological profiling. The cure was becoming worse than the disease, tearing apart relationships that had been the foundation of our success. My own position became increasingly precarious as the investigation continued. As one of the few people who had access to multiple levels of the organization, I was automatically suspect. The liaison made it clear that my continued survival depended on my ability to prove my loyalty and identify the real source of the security breach. But the more I learned about the investigation, the more I realized that the threat wasn't coming from traditional law enforcement. The federal agents knew things about the architect that no cop should have been able to discover. They was getting information from sources that existed at the very top of the criminal hierarchy. The revelation that changed everything came during a meeting with the liaison, where she explained why the federal investigation was so well informed. The architect himself was a federal informant, had been for years. The entire criminal empire was being run as a controlled operation, designed to gather intelligence on other criminal organizations while providing law enforcement with high-profile arrests and seizures when needed. Everyone below the architect's level, including regional managers like me, was expendable assets in a game we didn't even know we was playing. We thought we was building a criminal empire, but we was actually building our own prison. The scope of the deception was staggering. Every major decision, every strategic move, every personnel change had been designed to serve law enforcement objectives while maintaining the appearance of successful criminal operations. The money was real. The danger was real. The crimes was real. But the ultimate purpose was completely different from what we believed. The architect was using criminal organizations as weapons against other criminal organizations, feeding information to law enforcement that allowed them to dismantle competitors while protecting his own operations. We was unwitting soldiers in a war against other criminals. The liaison's offer was simple and terrifying. Continue operating as before, knowing the truth but keeping it secret, or be eliminated as a security risk. There was no option to leave the organization or expose what I'd learned. The architect's protection was complete. He had immunity agreements, witness protection arrangements, and a new identity waiting whenever he decided to retire from his role. But everyone else was trapped in a system designed to use them and eventually dispose of them. The criminal empire we'd built was our own sophisticated execution chamber. The psychological impact of learning the truth was devastating. Everything I'd accomplished, every relationship I'd built, every decision I'd made was based on a fundamental deception. The money I'd earned was tainted by the knowledge that it came from an operation designed to destroy people like me. The power I'd accumulated was meaningless because real power belonged to people I'd never met and never could meet. The future I'd planned was impossible because I was living in someone else's game with rules I'd never been told. The decision to run was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but staying would have meant accepting a role as a willing victim in my own destruction. I had maybe a week before the liaison would expect a final answer to her offer, and I knew that once I committed to continuing with the organization, there would be no second chances to escape. The security protocols that had protected us from law enforcement would be turned against me if I tried to leave. I had to disappear completely, abandon everything I'd built, and hope I could stay hidden long enough to figure out how to expose the truth without getting killed. The escape required careful planning and significant luck. I had access to false identities and financial resources that most people in my situation wouldn't have had. But I also knew that the architect's people would be looking for me using the same intelligence networks that had made the organization so successful. Every credit card transaction, every phone call, every security camera could potentially reveal my location. I had to assume that law enforcement was also looking for me, though I wasn't sure whether they wanted to arrest me or eliminate me as a potential threat to their operation. The evidence I'd gathered about the architect's real role was extensive but difficult to verify independently. Financial records, communication logs, meeting notes, all of it could be dismissed as the fantasies of a criminal trying to reduce his own legal exposure. But I also had names, dates, and details about operations that should have been impossible for me to know, unless I'd been part of the system I was describing. The challenge was finding someone in law enforcement who wasn't part of the architect's network and who would be willing to investigate one of their own most valuable assets. The isolation of life as a fugitive was compounded by the knowledge that I couldn't trust anyone completely. Former associates might be working for the architect. Law enforcement contacts might be. Part of the deception, even random strangers could potentially be surveillance assets. Paranoia became a survival skill, but it also made normal human relationships impossible. I was trapped between the criminal world I'd escaped and the legal world that might not want to hear what I had to say. The attempts to expose the truth about the architect met with resistance from unexpected sources. Journalists who initially showed interest in the story suddenly lost enthusiasm after making preliminary inquiries. Law enforcement agencies that should have been interested in corruption within their ranks seemed reluctant to investigate. Politicians who claimed to support criminal justice reform avoided getting involved in anything that might implicate federal operations. The architect's protection extended far beyond criminal organizations into the legitimate institutions that were supposed to provide oversight and accountability. The realization that I might never be able to safely expose what I'd learned was perhaps the most difficult part of my situation. The system that had created and protected the architect was too complex, too well established, and too valuable to too many people to be easily dismantled. My testimony alone wasn't sufficient to overcome the institutional interest that benefited from maintaining the status quo. But staying silent meant allowing the deception to continue, trapping other people in the same web that had consumed so many years of my life. The moral weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable, but it was also the only thing that kept me fighting to find a way to make the truth known.